Of Brutal Iron Gym. Here for the last video in kind of a series of videos we've created talking about how to address weaknesses in the main lifts of squat, bench, and deadlift. So this video is specific about the deadlift. However, in the very first video of the series we kind of talked about the concepts of why a person might be weak in one of these lifts or why they've kind of like plateaued at a certain weight. So the concepts we kind of discussed were technique issues, physical issues in terms of physical strength, and then mental issues. So those are kind of the three areas you want to look at whenever you're plateaued on a lift or if you're trying to figure out how to get stronger. So most often the first thing you want to look at is your technique. So that's usually a good place to start, because what you'll find is you probably have more strength than what you're currently using correctly. So if you can use your current strength better or more efficiently, you'll get an immediate boost in strength, and then as you continue to work on the physical components of the lift, then you'll get kind of sustained improvement. So that's kind of that first topic, that first video. That was a good one to kind of cover the broad base. So this one is for deadlifts specifically. So the first thing we want to look at is kind of the technique concepts for deadlifting. So we're not going to try to, in this video, kind of explain like here's a technique, here's all the ways you can fix it. So what I kind of want to review more so is here's the technical things I'll look at in a deadlift, and then kind of give you a chance to kind of, once we highlight it, think about how you do it and think about how to work on it. So the first thing, for example, is breathing and bracing on a deadlift. So very often when people do a deadlift, they don't have their core or their abs tight properly, so that's going to create a lot of weakness in their midsection. So if they're driving through the floor from their legs, and that energy is supposed to travel through the body and up into the through the body and down into the barbell, we need that. We need everything in the body to be very tight, so that way that energy can go from the feet all the way to the bar. So it's going to transfer through our body. So if we have a muscle loose here or muscle loose there, or our core isn't totally braced right, when we go to push off the floor, our body will bend a little bit, and that means we lost some energy, or it'll have back pain, which means something wasn't braced correctly. So usually what you're trying to do with breathing and bracing, some cues I kind of teach is the first thing you want to do before you kind of bend down to grab the bar or do anything, before you accept weight into the body, is to kind of flex the pelvic floor. So you want to kind of do that first, and that's going to cue as you go up into tightening the ab muscles. That'll cue everything being really tight. So flexing the pelvic floor is the same thing kind of muscular wise as trying to like stop yourself from peeing, so trying to like hold your pee. So that'll give you the feeling of flexing your pelvic floor. And then from there we tell the person to kind of to take a big breath, but try to take a belly breath. So they're not going to breathe into their chest and go and lift their chest. They're more so going to try to breathe and expand their stomach. So if you don't have a belt on when you deadlift, one of the cues I give a person is to take a big belly breath, but then try to pull their belly button into their backbone. And what will happen is it kind of braces their core midline instead of having them being overextended. So you'll see their back, sometimes people, they're either round over poorly because their stomach wasn't braced, or they'll be overarched, and again because they're more so flexing the lower back but not paying attention to the abs. So we want to take some air into the belly and then flex that belly button down and into the backbone, and that's going to help to straighten their core and keep it nice and tight. If you do have a belt, you can kind of do the same cues, but you're going to use the belt as like an external stimulus. So you want to take a big belly breath and then push out against the belt. So you're not going to try to push only in your belly, you're going to try to push out to the sides, to the back, just everywhere. You're going to try to push out to the belt. It's almost like you were trying to make the belt like explode off of you. So you take a big belly breath and then push out into the belt, and that'll give you really nice tightness. So the next thing we have there is stance width. if you're doing conventional versus sumo, we'll kind of go through. The breathing would have been the same for both. So conventionally standing, basically what that is you're going to have your feet more so underneath you, and when you grab the bar, your hands are going to be on the outside of you, so kind of the outside underneath your shoulders. So in that type of stance, conventional deadlift, you'll hear sometimes people have really narrowed stance, sometimes people have a little bit of a wider stance. What I've found is it's going to kind of play into their strengths. If they have a stronger lower back, they might be prone to take more of a narrowed stance, because that'll tilt them forward more and give their lower back more power or more positional power. If they tend to have stronger legs, they'll take a little bit of a wider stance, and what that does allows them more of an upright torso, and they can drive the bar off the floor using their legs. So that's one reason why you'll see people pick like either a very narrowed stance or a little bit of a wider stance. The other reason is kind of torso size. So if a person has a big belly, but they take a narrowed stance, for them to get down to the bar, they might have to lose back positioning in order to try to get to the bar. Whereas if they were to open up their stance a little bit, that'll give room between their thighs for their stomach to drop down some more, and they can keep a flatter back. Likewise, if a person's kind of a thinner torso, they might like a very narrowed stance, because that kind of creates some tightness. So as they bend down to grab the bar, they'll be able to stay very tight, and their power will be right underneath them. So those are kind of two reasons why you'd pick either a narrowed or a wide stance in conventional. So you're just going to have to play around with those and see what works for you. So again, if you're like bigger belly, you might need a little bit wider. If you're a smaller torso, but it'll narrow. If you're kind of depending on your lower back more, it'll be a narrow stance. If you're going to try to drive from your legs more, it'll be a little bit of a wider. But it's all within the realm of a conventional deadlift. So if we think of a sumo deadlift, generally speaking, when a person is in the bottom position, their hands are on the bar, their hips are in place, and they're ready to drive from the floor, their knees should be kind of over top their heels. So it'll look like almost like the legs are slanted out a little bit due to the size of the calf on the inside of the leg. But in general, their knees should be above their heels, or ever so slightly their heels will be outside their knees. So generally when you're going to try to create a drive from the floor on a sumo pull, is you're going to be kind of like trying to split the floor apart. So if your knees are outside your feet, you're going to have a horrible time trying to do that cue. So that's why having the feet directly underneath or the feet ever so slightly out helps you do that cue, splitting the floor. And that'll create really good hip tightness, and then you can push the rest of the way up. So using your quads and flexing your glutes. So that's generally the position you'll want for sumo. You may see some people take a narrowed sumo stance in order to get more drive from their thighs and lower back and a little bit less from their hips. Almost like they're trying to get a conventional feel out of a sumo pull. Still in that position, they're going to have that knees over heels kind of format. So they're just not going to have their knees as flared open, so their hips is opened up. So that's kind of the idea for stance. I'm going to try to go a little faster, otherwise this video is going to take forever. So hand placement, your hands are directly going to be, most often going to be directly underneath your shoulders. So just kind of like a straight down from your shoulders position. So sometimes you'll see people, if they're a little bow-legged, or if they have a big belly and big thighs, they tend to maybe have to take a little bit of a wider grip. So, but in general, you want to have your hands straight underneath. For upper back tightness, you'll see that very often when a person tries to drive from the floor, all of a sudden their back will kind of loosen a little, but then it settles and then they push even faster. So what's happening is that those muscles are kind of where they thought they were tight and flexed. The muscles had to accept the pressure and they loosened. And then during that process of loosening, the body's going to down-regulate its explosive power. So once it thinks you're settled, then all of a sudden you'll see the person push faster. So what will help that, two cues, is when you have your hands on the bar and you're trying to create back tightness, you want to pinch your upper arm into the side of you. So an idea of that, like I like to tell clients, is imagine like somebody's fingers are in your armpit and you're going to try to pinch their fingers. So you don't want to lift like up to pinch. Your shoulders should be down, but then pinched in real hard. The other cue we have here of twist is to twist your elbows. So it's almost like you're going to take the bar like it's a thin piece of metal and you're trying to like bend it around your legs. So you're going to kind of like, once you grab the bar, you're going to twist your elbows in, and that'll help you lock in your lower lats as well. So the pinch technique kind of takes care of the upper lats. The twisting technique kind of takes care of the lower lats. So when you combine that, you get pretty good upper back tightness. So then the concept of pulling out slack. So again, this kind of comes down to when you drive off the floor to prevent that back from like bending over or loosening, or to prevent any kind of like loss of energy when you drive through the floor, is pulling out slack. So what that means is when you grab onto the bar, you get your back tight and you're ready to go, you should already be lifting on the barbell. So there should already be tension between you and the bar before you drive with your legs. So one thing I'll tell my clients is when they're setting up, when they grab the bar and they're creating tightness, they should be lifting on the bar to where you'll hear like the bar click into the top of the weights. Or another really good sound cue is whenever they drive off the floor, there should be no loud click of the weight. It should already be tight. You might hear the weights like wobble, but there shouldn't be like a catch, like a big boom kind of a sound. So if there is, the chances are they weren't tight enough. So you might see some cases where somebody does this and they're pretty strong to deadlift, but it's not very common at all. So it's more common to have people be very tight. You'll have a better use of your energy, so there'll be less loss as you drive from the floor. So the next thing we have is loading the hips and the hamstrings. So most people tend to be dominant in their quadriceps, so versus their hamstrings. So they'll tend to start the deadlift from their toes. So they'll start to push either midfoot or off their toes. Ideally, you want to be midfoot to heel, if not more so on your heels. So one cue I give clients is you should be able to twinkle your toes. So before you push from the floor, and that means that your weight's going to be loaded into your heel and midfoot, not into your toes. So what that does, it gives your hamstrings, your kind of posterior chain, your hamstrings, your glutes, and your lower back, more of a consistent start. So they won't have to kind of catch the weight midway. They'll be initiated into the weight right from the start. So kind of there's a bunch of different ways on how to figure that out. So I usually tend to do, when I teach clients, is to do what I call a top-down approach. I've stolen it from other people who are smarter than me. So, but basically what you do is you have the person, they'll have their stance set, they'll put their hands, they'll bend over from the hips like almost like a stiff leg deadlift start. They'll get their hands in position. Then what they'll do is they'll find their head placement, they'll get the pinch, the lift, everything tight in their upper body. And then what the last thing they'll do is they'll shift their weight to their heels and then start to bring their hips down towards position. And once they feel their body get really tight, then they want to fire and push from there. So they don't want to start pushing like when the hips are too high. So you have to kind of gather tension and feel the tightness. So, and then when you think you're tight, then you'll fire 100%. And what that's going to do is give you a lot better chance to get your feel from your hamstrings, glutes, and lower back. So then the other last thing we have is thinking of the deadlift as a push versus a pull. So if you do the deadlift incorrectly, so is you'll see a person almost start to lift from their head. They'll lift their head, then it looks like they're trying to lift their shoulders, then their mid-back, then their butt, then they push. So when you think of it like in that sense, they're trying to like pull the bar, that's going to be a really weak way of starting the lift. So instead you want to think of it as pushing the bar. So what that means is you're going to start your entire energy wave by driving through your feet into the floor. So what you'll find then is visual cue is their head won't move. So the initial movement is going to be them driving off the floor. You'll see the bar and their hips pick up if it's good form. The bar and their hips should pick up, and then as the bar continues to go up, their hips will drive forward to kind of meet the bar. So that's kind of the pathway we want, is more of a push off the floor rather than a pull where they start with their head. So I don't have it written down here because I just don't have it right now, but head placement, there are people who teach a bunch of different ways and people who are successful in different ways, whether head up is head up or head down. I tend to teach not necessarily head down like they're staring at the floor, but head neutral. So what that means is if I'm in a forward position like this, head neutral would be with my head is in line with the spine, so I won't have my head up. What I tend to find is when people have their head up, it tends to overarch their lower back. So if we get their head neutral, in line with their spine, they have a better chance of feeling evenness or straightness from their hips all the way to their head. Whereas as soon as they lift their head, they tend to overarch their back. So again, you kind of got to try and see what works for you, but that would be a good place to start. Try with a neutral head position and see if that helps as you keep practicing and getting used to it. So the physical components, so that's all technical stuff. So how do you get physically stronger in different areas of the lift is kind of the next section here. So we have, if you have a problem with lockout, so you can get the bar off the floor, but it kind of just fizzles out right above your knee. Generally, one of the best ways to address that is with reverse banded deadlifts. So where you deadlift in a squat rack and have bands from the top. The reason why I really like this for myself and with clients, for example, I took my deadlift, I had a torn meniscus, so I had to take some time off of squatting, but I was still trying to work on my deadlift. And I took my deadlift from 600 to 660 in a matter of like 4 months-ish. So just from working on reverse band and speed work. So this stuff does really help. So reverse band, what you'll do is you'll have, again, like in a squat rack, bands from the top down to the bar. The reason why this works really well is it emphasizes the top part of the deadlift. So if that's where your problem is, you want to emphasize that spot. So reverse banding allows the deadlift to be lighter off the floor. So you'll have an easier start to the lift. But then as you lift, the bands become looser and the lift can become overloaded at the top end. So let's say you're working at 405. So and that's your goal right now. And you can get it off the floor, but once you get above your knees, it kind of fizzles out. So again, you would want to first look at the technique. So that could be a huge component as to why you're fizzling out at the top. You just might not have started in the right position at the bottom. So but if you're looking at physical adaptation, what you can do with reverse banding is you can set up reverse bands to where off the floor it's only, say, 380, 385. And then as you get to the top, it transitions through 405 to being something like 415 or 425 at the lockout. So and what that does, it overloads that lockout and it gets you the feeling of lifting heavier and heavier weights. So sometimes when people are trying to break a lift down into components, for example, like let's say you want to do rack pulls, so or elevated deadlifts. So you're going to put on a 4-inch block and try to drive from there. Still, you have to come up with the initiation, the effort to put into driving the bar initially from the start. So if you're just doing straight weight off blocks, most people tend to be limited by just getting that stupid weight started, and then they can get into their lockout, but they're already slow at the lockout, or they're already like kind of worn out from trying to get that lift started. So when you do reverse banding, it helps you get speed into that area, so that way you can handle heavier overloaded weights more successfully and with better form. So also reverse banded deadlifts doesn't change the form of the deadlift, whereas an elevated deadlift you're now starting the deadlift off the floor at a different height, so it's going to change your positioning. So very often you'll see people who are really good at elevated deadlifts and they kind of are not as good, or they can't lift as much off the floor. So what you'll see is sometimes changing that positioning, it allows for an ease of their hips, or allows for a better starting position. So they might have the chance to work that lockout, but they're working it with a different start to the lift. So that's why I prefer reverse banded. The other thing we have here is band hip resistance. So if a person at the lockout is getting the bar kind of to their knees, but they're not getting their butt and hips to drive forward into the bar, their butt's kind of staying back here and they're trying to pull the bar like back to them, that's not going to work at really heavy weights. So what we do is I tend to, with clients and with myself, is we'll attach a band behind them somewhere, either on the squat rack, or we'll put a bar across the rack on the opposite side. Can't see my hand over there. So, but we'll put a bar on the back side of the rack and then anchor off that bar, and we'll have them in the middle of the rack. And what we do is we put a band around their waist. So what it does is when they drive off the floor, and whenever they would be normally supposed to bring their hips in, the band would be resisting them. So if they normally kind of like only halfway get their hips in, they might be able to fudge it by pushing their knees under the bar and kind of finishing in a kind of a broken pattern where they, what's called like scooping the deadlift, or they'll drive their knees under and flex their quads to finish rather than getting their glutes to do it. So by reverse banding, it forces them to have to drive their hips forward, otherwise they're going to fall over. So once you kind of teach the body how to do that or what that feels like, then when you take the bands off, they'll have that movement pattern in their brain, and they'll be able to find that pattern and fire faster through their glutes. So if they have trouble off the floor, one of the simple, really good techniques is called off the floor pause. So you would literally just pick the bar up 1 inch and then try to generate force. So what that's going to do, it's going to do a lot of benefits for your technique, and will show it's going to give really good help for getting tight off the floor, and it's going to actually help build your strength around the knees. So, but if you have trouble getting off the floor, what you want to do is start with lighter weights, and you can even reverse band, use reverse banding, so you still maximally train your lockout at the same time. But as you would start the bar, you'd get yourself real tight, you'd push from the floor, but with the goal of only lifting the bar off the floor about 1 inch, and then you're going to try to accelerate and push as hard as you can. So that's going to teach you to get leg drive and really have to push from your legs to generate force. So you won't be able to rely on your lower back in that position, so you'll have to rely more so on your legs. And again, that'll teach you the signaling of how to fire your legs and what that feels like. So again, if your problem is getting tight, so that's the next thing we have down here. So if you feel like when you go to leave the floor, your whole body just kind of folds over and it gets out of place, these off the floor pauses will help to fix that as well. And you're doing the same lift, but you can kind of think of it as differently, in the sense to where what you'll be analyzing with that technique is you'll get tight or where you think you are tight, and then you'll go to lift the bar off the floor 1 inch. And if during that 1 inch your body changes or something loosens, that means you were not tight. So that gives you immediate feedback. So ideally you'd like to keep working on these techniques over here, so that way when you're trying to lift that bar 1 inch, nothing really moves in your body. It's just a simple leg push, but nothing rounds in your upper back, nothing loosens. So that'll give you immediate feedback if you are tight from the floor. So, and then if you have struggling around the knees, where like you'll blast the bar off the floor, then right around your knees it kind of struggles. 99% of the time, or most often with my case, like clients, it's just poor technique. So they weren't in a good position right from the start, right off the floor. So they push through their toes most often, or they'll have their head up and their butt like kind of arched. And when they drive to get the bar to the knees, that's whenever the posterior chain should have already been engaged, and they should already be trying to drive their glutes in, but nothing was engaged. So they were overarched, which meant that they didn't have the hamstrings and glutes kind of into the lift. They were more so using lower back and quads to drive from the floor, and then their hamstrings and glutes can't be in the good position to drive forward. So, or if they're too far on their toes, they just loaded their quads to drive off the floor, and then midway their hamstrings are supposed to try to find themselves. So it's easier if right from the start you already have the hamstrings engaged. So usually if a person is struggling around the knees, we look at positioning first, right off the floor. And then, once we think we have the positioning, we go into the off the floor pause deadlifts. So I know this is repeating that technique over and over again, but it does work on a lot of good things. And within that off the floor pause, you can create variations by using chains and bands and all this stuff. So what's called accommodating resistance. So what sometimes you'll hear people argue whether beginners should use bands and chains or if they should just stick with weight. Most of the time that argument is based around learning technique. So you shouldn't use enough bands and chains where your technique is thrown off and the lift now becomes a variation of the lift. So if somebody is new to lifting, you want to stick with basic main movements so they can learn the technique, but throwing on a little bit of band tension in order to create better signaling with the movement, that's actually going to help their technique. So I'm not opposed to using bands on beginners, especially if you're using it as signaling cues, not as some overloaded craziness that they have to then change their form for. So speed work, we kind of have an asterisk here for speed work because it relates to lockout. So sometimes when people miss the lockout of their deadlift is they were just too slow. So they were strong enough to get it off the floor, strong enough to push to their knees, but then they just kind of ran out of speed and ran out of power at the top. So if they can learn to move faster, they will actually in turn get stronger. So speed work, you can, if you're familiar with West Side method or conjugate method, it's called dynamic effort training. So the idea of speed work is exactly what it is to get faster at moving weights. So speed is part of power and strength. So if I have X amount of strength but I can get twice as fast, then I'm going to be able to move something a lot better. So the idea of speed work is we want to put bands on the bar, and you don't want to lift. The idea of the weight is what we have written here, is how much weight do we use when we do speed work. These are generalities, so what I'm going to say is something to start with and then kind of see how you do from there. We want to start with a weight that's not so light that if you try to be explosive, you'll pull yourself out of position. But it's also not so heavy that you can't even be fast with it. The whole idea of speed training is to move it quickly. So you want to move the weight as fast as you can. So like I said though, the key is you want to move it as fast as you can while staying in good form. So we want to have enough weight on the bar and enough band resistance to where you can pull it as hard as you can, but you're not going to fall over backwards, or you're not going to like end up doing like some kind of high pull, so where it's going to come flying up out of place. So where we usually tell people is to use 50% of your normal 1 rep max with weights, and then you want to add 25% of band tension. So the 50% of 1 rep max, that's kind of easy to figure out. So if I have a 405 max, I should be using about 200 pounds of plate weight. So, and then the band tension at 25%, that's a little bit weird, but one way I try to tell clients is to think of is when you're setting this up, try to set up the band tension first on an empty bar, and you want to set it up to where it feels like 25% of your normal weight. So if you have a 405 max, you should set up some band tension and on the empty bar, so at the top of the lift it feels like about 100 pounds, it feels like 25%. So if a person has like a 600 pound lift, they would do it to whatever 600 divided by 4 is. So what's that, 150 pounds? So there you go. So that's how much band tension it should feel like. And then they would add plate weight up to 50% of their 1 rep max. So in total it'll be 75%. And that's light enough that you can be fast with it, but heavy enough that you won't most likely get out of position. So the last thing we have is positioning. So if they feel like during their lift they kind of feel strong at their, maybe right off the floor, they feel weak at their knees, then they feel strong at their lockout. So what the chances are is that that middle range is somehow you're getting out of position. So we use the technique of slowed eccentrics and concentrics. So what that means is we're just going to do a slow motion deadlift. So we'll do a 5 seconds on the way up, 5 seconds on the way down. And what that does, it makes them spend more time under all parts of the range of motion, and then they can develop their strength in that weak area. So it literally is, it's just like they'll start the deadlift like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There'll be a lockout. Then they lower it down slowly, reversing the exact same pathway of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And what that does, is you can hear by how slow that is in me counting it, is it forces them to spend more time in all parts of the range of motion, so that way they can build their power and improve their positioning off the floor, around the knees, and at lockout. So it just kind of improves their awareness of all their positions throughout the full range of motion. So those are physical ways of kind of variations of a major deadlift. So you can do glute ham raises, good mornings, all these other things too, like these accessory lifts. But the whole point of this video is just to point out variations of the main lift that'll help these different areas. So the last component we have here is the mental aspect of getting better at a 1 rep max or getting better at deadlifts. These are kind of universal for all 3 lifts, but you want to think of practice and review. So what this means is we want to practice the lift. So if I want to get better at it, I have to do it more often, but I have to make sure that what I'm doing is of good quality. So it doesn't help me to just do 1,000 deadlifts if I wasn't paying attention to whether there were 1,000 good deadlifts. So one of the things you can do is use technology nowadays and use your cell phone and actually film yourself doing like your sets and reps, and then analyze and review how you did. So do set 1, then think of the cues that we have listed here, watch the video and see if you did the cues correctly. Maybe you missed 1 or 2 cues, so in the next set you'll try to correct those. So that's the idea of using video, is between each set you're going to kind of watch yourself, analyze how you did, then try to improve on the next set. The other concept we have here is cue cards. So you can actually take like a sheet of paper and write down the cues that you want to work on, and then have that near the deadlift platform, and between each set actually read through your cues. So it seems redundant or boring, but it actually does work really well. A lot of clients have enjoyed using that technique, and they feel it kind of helps keep them focused. So sometimes people get in the habit of talking in between sets, and then they'll do the set and then say, oh crap, I forgot to do X. Well, you got to stay more focused than that if you want to get good. So you can read over these cue cards, and it'll help you remind yourself of everything you want to be working on from set to set to set. The other thing we have is extended warm-up sets. So if I'm working up to say a 405 and I normally just come in the gym, do 135, 225, 315, maybe 365, then I maybe get or don't get a 405. That's not a lot of practice sets before your heavy weight. So you want to take the time and kind of do more in between sets, and that gives you more chances to practice. So you can try even just the bar and try to build up the pathway. Then you can throw on 25 if you want. But it's definitely a good idea to start at, like, say, 135, 185, 225, 275, 315, 365, maybe even 385, and then 405. So getting more of those practice sets in is going to give you a better chance to work on your cues. It's going to give you more time under tension, so you're going to get physically stronger. So whereas if you just jump to your heavy weights, whether you do well or don't do well, you're all of a sudden exhausted, and very often people don't come back and get all that work in. So they're going to say, well, I don't want to get worn out from a big lift, but then they go do their big lift and they're worn out and don't do anything afterwards. So it's better to put the work in beforehand if you know you're not going to be disciplined enough to do it afterwards. So the only thing that's a caveat to that is if you are doing a 1 rep max test, it's a good idea to kind of keep the number of reps per set low, so when you do, keep yourself kind of fresh for that 1 rep max. So you might still do all the sets that I suggested, but only 1 or 2 reps at each weight versus trying to do 5 or 10 reps at each weight. So however, that's only for 1 rep max testing, so most of the time you should be training in order to build your strength, and then it's okay to do our extended warm-up sets. Because if you're 5 or 10 pounds weaker by the time you get to the top, who cares? The intent of that day is to build the body and build the techniques, so maximal weight is not your focus anyhow. So that's our video for deadlifting, and that completes the series of how to address weaknesses for our main lifts. So if you have questions about this video or the series in general, you can send us an email at brutalirongym@gmail.com, and that's brutalirongym, all small letters, all one word, @gmail.com. Okay, hopefully this was helpful. Thank you.